Ever feel like when you're really trying to get your head around something new, it's like your brain just kind of hits a wall?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into cognitive load theory, which is, well, it's a pretty powerful way to make sense of those limitations and, more importantly, figure out how we can actually learn better.
Absolutely learning smarter, not harder, right?
Exactly, by working with our brains instead of battling against them. And for this deep dive, we've got a really fantastic resource to guide us.
Yeah, we're looking at a big review article, Cognitive Architecture and Instructional Design, 20 years later, by Sweller, Van Marienboer, and Paes.
So, really getting into the nitty gritty.
It is. It's sort of like our expert guide, looking back at how our understanding of learning has changed over the years and where it might be headed.
Right. So, where are we going with all this learning stuff, right? And our goal today is to, take this article and really pull out those key takeaways, the things that we really need to know about how we process information and how that actually impacts, whether we learn something or not.
Yeah.
And it's funny because we've known for a while now about working memory and long-term memory, right?
Yeah.
But it's really only relatively recently that we've kind of grasped how important that is for actually designing learning experiences.
And it's cognitive load theory that really brought those pieces together, right? Made those connections. So the basic idea is, you run into something new and it first hits your working memory. That's
Mm.
like your mental scratch pad, the
Uh-huh.
place where you're actively trying to make sense of things.
Right, right.
And it's limited, right, that working memory.
It is very much so.
Yeah. But if you process that information effectively, it then moves into long-term memory. And that's, as far as we know, that's pretty much limitless,
Mm.
hopefully. And it's that transfer from working memory to long-term memory, that's what actually changes. Like your cognitive abilities, what you know, and what you can do.
Yeah. So basically, the question that cognitive load theory is trying to answer is, how does all that mental effort that we're putting in, while we're learning, how does that affect our ability to actually learn something new?
Yeah, exactly. And it comes down to managing what's called cognitive load.
Right.
And that's basically the total mental effort that that's being asked of your cognitive system.
And it's important to remember, right, that it's not just how hard the material is.
Right.
It could be made harder by bad instructions or a messy environment.
Anything that's unnecessary that takes up mental resources. Of course, if the material is really complex, then that by itself is going to increase the cognitive load.
Right, yeah. So the key takeaway here is we need to be really strategic about how we manage this load, right?
Yeah.
So we want to minimize what they call extraneous load. That's like the mental clutter.
Yeah, from bad design. Yeah.
Exactly. But at the same time, we also want to optimize what's called germane load, right?
Exactly.
And that's the mental work that actually helps us understand something and build knowledge.
Exactly. It's like using our mental energy wisely.
Yeah. And of course, doing all of this while keeping in mind that working memory is very limited.
Yeah, we can't just cram everything in there. And, this whole understanding that didn't just, appear overnight.
Right, yeah.
There was a lot of early groundwork in the 80s for cognitive load theory, but it was really that 1998 paper that brought everything together.
Right, yeah, a really influential paper. And in that paper, they actually identify 3 different types of cognitive load. So let's start with intrinsic cognitive load. What is that?
Well, it's basically about the inherent difficulty of whatever you're trying to learn. But here's where it gets interesting, right? That difficulty, it's not fixed.
Right.
It also depends on what you, the learner, already know. That's where this idea of element interactivity comes in.
Okay.
It's basically how interconnected all the different bits of information are that you're trying to learn.
Right.
So if something has high element interactivity, it means you can't understand one part without understanding all the others.
Oh, okay.
So for example, think about reading the word characteristics.
Okay.
Now, if you're a fluent reader, you don't really think about it. You process it as one unit.
Right.
But if you're just learning to read, you're looking at each letter, sounding it out right.
Right.
So each letter feels like a separate element that you have to process, and that makes the task much harder.
Right. Yeah. So for someone who knows how to read, the intrinsic load of that word is low, but for someone who's just learning, it's high.
Exactly. And that's because of all those interacting elements. And what the paper points out is that we can really only change intrinsic load in 2 ways, either by simplifying what needs to be learned or by, the learner becoming more of an expert over time.
Yeah, you're not going to suddenly become an expert on something overnight.
Nope. Hmm. And then the second type of cognitive load is extraneous cognitive load.
Okay.
And this is the one we have more control over. We can change it by, how we design instruction, how we present the information.
Okay.
So if you use ineffective teaching methods, you can actually make the element interactivity worse,
Hmm.
and that makes learning much harder than it needs to be.
Okay, so an example of that would be like a really cluttered textbook page.
Right, exactly. Imagine a textbook where the text is wrapped around unrelated images. It's hard to follow.
Yes.
That would be adding extraneous load, even if the concept itself isn't that difficult.
Right. Even if the material itself is simple, it's the way it's presented to you that can make it difficult.
Exactly. And the 98 paper showed that many of the techniques that we know work well for teaching, they work by reducing that extraneous load.
Right. Okay. So then there's the third type, germane cognitive load, right?
Yes.
And my understanding is that our thinking about this one has kind of changed since the 98 paper.
You're right. Our understanding has evolved. Initially, we thought of it as the load specifically dedicated to learning, almost like a good kind of load,
Right.
replacing the extraneous load with germane load.
Right. Yeah.
But when researchers started doing studies, they found something interesting. When they reduced extraneous load through good instructional design, the total cognitive load actually went down.
Okay.
And that didn't really fit with the idea of just adding germane load on top or swapping it with extraneous load.
Right.
So now we think of germane cognitive load more like how we direct our attention and use the limited resources of working memory.
Okay.
When we minimize that extraneous processing, that mental clutter, we free up resources to deal with the actual complexity of the material, the intrinsic load.
Okay.
And that allows us to process it more deeply and actually build knowledge in long-term memory.
So it's not really an additional load. It's
Yeah.
more like we're using our mental energy better.
Exactly. We're just using our cognitive capacity more effectively.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So the 98 paper, it really laid the groundwork, introduced these three types of cognitive load, and then it also went on to describe 7 instructional effects.
Yes, it did.
And, most of them had to do with reducing that extraneous load.
Right.
So let's look at those. The first one is the goal-free effect.
This is a fascinating one. So traditional problem solving often involves something called means-ends analysis. You're constantly comparing where you are now to where you want to be and figuring out the steps to get there.
Okay, I can see that.
Yeah, and this process can take up a lot of working memory.
Right, yeah, like constantly checking a map instead of just focusing on the road.
Exactly. So with the goal-free effect, you get rid of that specific end goal. You replace it with more open-ended problems. So, for example, that classic problem with the accelerating car. Instead of asking, how far did the car travel? You could ask, what can we figure out about this car's motion?
Okay.
And what researchers found is that in those goal-free situations, learners start to explore more deeply. They focus on the underlying principles instead of just getting the right answer.
That's really counterintuitive. You'd think having a clear goal would be better.
You would, right?
Yeah.
But it seems that in the early stages of learning, having that specific goal can actually get in the way of developing a broader understanding. By removing the goal, you encourage a more exploratory approach.
Okay, so it's like you're allowing them to wander around a bit more and discover things on their own.
Exactly, and that can lead to a more robust understanding.
Okay, that makes sense. And the next effect is the worked example effect.
Yeah, that one's a little more intuitive. The basic idea is, instead of having learners struggle through a new problem from scratch, you give them a fully worked out solution. They can study it, analyze it.
So it's like giving them a blueprint instead of just a pile of lumber.
Exactly. And the research shows that studying these work examples can really reduce cognitive load. It focuses your attention on the solution steps. And that helps you figure out how to solve similar problems.
Okay.
There's even research showing different types of worked examples are effective. Some focus on the product, some on the process, some even use human models.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's a whole area of research. But the main takeaway is, for beginners, studying worked examples is often better than trying to solve problems from scratch.
Okay. Are there any caveats with worked examples?
Yeah, definitely. As learners become more expert, worked examples might not be as helpful. We'll talk about that later with the expertise reversal effect.
Okay.
And it's also really important that the worked examples are well designed. If they're not clear, or if they introduce redundancy, they can actually make things worse.
Right, so the blueprint itself needs to be easy to understand.
Exactly. And then we have the completion problem effect.
Okay, this one sounds interesting. Like a middle ground between worked examples and solving problems independently.
You got it. It's like a partially solved problem where the learner has to fill in the blanks. It's a kind of scaffolding, encourages deeper processing.
Oh, I like that analogy. It's like training wheels.
Yeah, perfect. You get some support, but you still have to do the work.
Right.
And there's this idea of a completion strategy, where you gradually increase the amount the learner has to do,
Ooh.
starting with lots of support and then fading it away as they get better.
Okay, I can see how that would be effective.
Yeah, it really helps build confidence and understanding.
All right, let's move on to the next one, the split attention effect. I always think of those terrible assembly instructions with the tiny diagrams.
Oh yeah, we've all been there,
Yeah.
fighting with IKEA furniture.
Exactly.
So the split attention effect is what happens when you have to mentally integrate information from different sources.
Right, like if the diagram is on a different page than the instructions.
Exactly. And that mental integration takes up valuable working memory, making it harder to learn. A classic example is geometry.
Okay.
A geometric theorem without a diagram is hard to understand. But if the diagram is on a separate page, your brain has to work overtime to connect the two.
Right, and the solution seems so obvious, just put the text on the diagram.
Exactly. Physically integrate the information and you get rid of that split attention problem.
Right.
And this can happen across time too, not just space. Think about a video with bad narration timing.
Oh, yeah, where the voiceover is explaining something completely different from what you're seeing on the screen.
Exactly. That's temporal split attention. Keep things connected, both visually and temporally.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, the next one is the redundancy effect, which I remember being a bit counterintuitive.
It is, isn't it? It basically says that presenting the same information in multiple formats can actually be worse than just using one.
Wait, really? Why would that be?
So imagine you have a diagram of the heart and then a big chunk of text explaining the same thing.
Okay.
Your brain will automatically try to process both. Even if the information's identical, it'll try to compare and reconcile them.
Oh, okay.
And that takes up unnecessary mental resources. There's a classic study from way back in 1937 showing that young kids learning nouns actually did better when they just saw the words without pictures.
So sometimes less is more.
Absolutely. Don't overload them with redundant information.
Okay, that's interesting. Then we have the modality effect, which seems to offer a solution to some of those split attention issues.
Right, so this one's based on the idea that our working memory has separate channels for processing visual and auditory information.
Okay, so we can kind of process those two things simultaneously.
Exactly. So if you have something that could cause split attention, like a complex diagram, you can present the text as spoken narration instead of just writing it on the diagram.
Oh, I see. So you're using both channels.
Exactly. And that can actually increase your processing capacity. Like, imagine a complex diagram with lots of labels. Instead of putting all those labels directly on the diagram, you could have someone explain them.
Right, use voiceover.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That way you're not overloading the visual channel. And there's a lot of research supporting the modality effect. It can be very powerful.
Okay, interesting. And finally, we have the variability effect.
Yeah.
And this one, if I remember correctly, actually involves increasing cognitive load.
You're right. It's about intentionally manipulating intrinsic load. So the idea is, by giving learners a variety of problems that share the same underlying principles, you force them to generalize their knowledge.
Okay, so they have to figure out what's common and what's just surface level variation.
Exactly. And that can be really helpful for long-term learning and transfer. But here's the catch. It only works if the total load stays within their limits.
Right, so you don't want to overwhelm them.
Exactly. It's like, practicing basketball shots from different positions.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Makes you a more adaptable player. But if you try to do too much too soon, it'll backfire.
Right, right.
And the paper emphasizes that this variability effect interacts with the format of the learning activity.
Okay.
So for instance, variability might be really good when you're using worked examples because the initial load is lower. But it could be too much if they're still struggling to solve problems on their own.
Right, so you have to be strategic about when you introduce that variability.
Exactly. First, minimize the extraneous load, and then carefully increase the germane load to promote deeper understanding.
So it's really about striking a balance, isn't it?
It is. And that 98 paper, it was a landmark. It laid out all these crucial ideas about cognitive load.
Yeah. And then, of course, research has continued since then, right?
Absolutely. There's been so much work in the field, refining the theory, finding new effects.
Right. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about how cognitive load theory has evolved over the past couple of decades, from 1998 to 2018. The article highlights several key developments during this period.
Absolutely. It's been a really productive time for the theory. One of the biggest changes has been the integration of ideas from evolutionary psychology.
Oh, interesting. How did that come about?
Well, evolutionary psychology gives us a new way to think about different types of knowledge. There's this distinction between biologically primary knowledge and biologically secondary knowledge that's really important.
What's the difference?
So biologically, primary knowledge is stuff we're basically pre-programmed to learn. Things like language, basic social skills, some general problem solving. These are things we pick up naturally.
Oh, okay.
And a key insight from evolutionary psychology is that while these skills are essential, trying to teach them directly doesn't always work well.
Okay, so you're saying we can't just teach someone thinking skills in a general sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of emphasis on problem-solving skills in education, but the evidence that training those skills transfers to other areas is weak.
Makes sense. It's hard to imagine learning a general thinking skill that applies to everything.
Right. And then we have biologically secondary knowledge. This is the stuff that requires conscious effort, instruction, formal education.
Okay.
Things like reading, writing, math. These are domain-specific skills.
So we learn to speak naturally, but we need to be taught how to read and write.
Exactly. That's a great example.
Yeah.
And the evolutionary perspective tells us that while we can't directly teach those broad, general skills, we can use them as a foundation to teach the more specific skills.
Okay.
So, for example, in medicine, doctors learn communication methods like SBR. That stands for Situation, Background, Assessment, Recommendation.
Okay.
And this builds on their existing language skills to help them communicate clearly in high-pressure situations.
Right.
So it's a domain-specific skill that leverages a more general, biologically primary skill.
So it's like building on what we already know how to do naturally.
Exactly. And the article also mentions 5 biologically primary principles that are relevant to cognitive load theory. Do you want to hear about those?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so these principles basically describe some fundamental aspects of how our brains work. The first is the information store principle, which emphasizes how important long-term memory is for storing our knowledge. Then there's the borrowing and reorganizing principle, which highlights how much of what we know comes from others through social learning, observation, and instruction.
Okay.
And then there's the randomness as Genesis principle.
Okay, that sounds interesting.
It is. It's basically about our ability to come up with new solutions and behaviors, especially when our existing knowledge isn't enough.
So like trial and error learning.
Exactly. And then there's the narrow limits of change principle, which is really just another way of saying that our working memory is limited. And finally, we have the environmental organizing and linking principle.
Okay.
This one's about how we use cues from our environment to help us retrieve and apply the knowledge we've stored in long-term memory.
So it's like our surroundings can actually help us remember things.
Exactly. And all these principles together, they explain why the instructional methods that cognitive load theory recommends are so effective.
Right, because they're designed to minimize working memory overload and help us transfer information to long-term memory.
Precisely. Now, the article also talks about how cognitive load theory has been extended to the design of entire courses and curricula through the 4-component instructional design model.
Oh, right, the 4CID model.
Exactly. And this model was developed alongside cognitive load theory, specifically to address complex learning.
Okay.
Situations where the information is highly interconnected and you're trying to develop complex skills.
Right.
And it's based on 2 basic assumptions. First, that complex skills always involve a mix of skills that are used repeatedly and skills that are used less often. And second, that any good instructional program for complex learning can be structured around 4 key components.
Okay, so what are those components?
Well, the first one is learning tasks. These should be real-world tasks, as authentic as possible. And the complexity should gradually increase as the learner progresses.
Okay.
And crucially, the amount of support you give them should decrease over time. This is called guidance fading.
Right, like that completion strategy we talked about earlier.
Exactly. You start with a lot of support and gradually fade it away.
Okay. What's the second component?
The second component is supportive information.
Okay.
This is information that helps learners understand the underlying principles, the why, behind what they're doing. And it's most effective when it's presented separately from the learning tasks, especially early on, so you don't overload their working memory.
Right, so you're giving them the background knowledge they need, but not while they're in the middle of trying to do something.
Exactly. And then the third and fourth components are procedural information and part task practice.
Okay.
So these are about the more routine aspects of the skill. Procedural information is like step-by-step instructions or checklists. And it's best to give that information just in time, right when they need it.
Okay.
And that part task practice is about practicing specific sub-skills in isolation.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that this should be selective and directly support the overall learning tasks.
Right, so it's not just practicing for the sake of practicing.
Exactly. It should always be connected to the bigger picture.
So the 4CID model, it's really a way to apply the principles of cognitive load theory to the design of entire courses.
Exactly. It's about scaling up those principles to create effective learning experiences over time.
Okay, that's really interesting. Now, the article also talks about some new cognitive load effects that were discovered between 1998 and 2018. And some of these are called compound effects. What makes them different from the original 7 we discussed?
So compound effects are interesting because they don't work in a simple, direct way. They basically change how the other effects work.
Okay, so they're like modifiers.
Yeah, you could think of them that way. They tell us under what conditions the other effects are more or less likely to occur.
Okay.
Or they can even reverse the effect completely.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it gets pretty complex. So for example, one of these compound effects is the element interactivity effect.
Okay.
And this one tells us that the level of element interactivity in the material can actually change whether other cognitive load effects will even happen.
Okay.
So for example, the worked example effect, which is usually really helpful, can actually backfire if the material has low element interactivity.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Like if you're just learning basic definitions, it might be better to try and generate the answer yourself rather than just studying a worked example.
Okay, so you have to be careful about when you use certain techniques.
Exactly. It all depends on the nature of the material.
Right. Okay, what about the expertise reversal effect?
Ah, yes. This one's a big one.
Yeah, I remember reading about that.
So this one tells us that instructional techniques that work really well for beginners can actually become harmful as learners gain more expertise.
Okay, so what works for a novice might not work for an expert.
Exactly. As learners become more knowledgeable, they need different kinds of support.
Right.
So those worked examples that were so helpful early on, they might actually hinder learning later on.
Okay, so the training wheels need to come off eventually.
Exactly. Once
Yeah.
you know how to ride the bike, you don't need them anymore.
Right, they just get in the way.
Exactly. And this ties in with the guidance fading effect we talked about with the 4CID model.
Right, gradually reduce the support as learners gain expertise.
Precisely. And then there's the transient information effect.
Okay, what's that one about?
This one has to do with information that disappears quickly, like spoken words or animations.
Okay,
Your working memory has to work harder to hold on to that information.
makes sense.
So think about those fast-paced explainer videos. They might not be the best for learning complex stuff.
Right, because the information is coming at you too fast.
Exactly. And there are things you can do to help, like letting learners control the pace or breaking the information down into smaller chunks.
Okay, so you can chunk it or let them self-pace.
Exactly. And this effect can interact with the modality effect, too. While using audio can be helpful, long audio segments can overload the auditory channel.
Right?
So sometimes a well-designed visual might be better.
Okay, so it's not always about using both channels.
Right, it depends on the situation.
Right.
Then we have the self-management effect. This one's really empowering.
Okay.
Basically, it suggests that if you teach students about cognitive load theory, they can learn to manage their own cognitive load.
So you're giving them the tools to control their own learning.
Exactly. And studies have shown that students who get this training actually do better, even when they're working with poorly designed materials.
So they can compensate for bad instruction.
Yeah, in a way. They're more aware of how their minds work and what to do when things get tough.
Okay, I like that. So it's about giving them agency.
Exactly. And then there's the self-explanation effect.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that one. Isn't it about encouraging students to talk to themselves?
Well, not exactly talk to themselves, but to explain things to themselves as they're learning.
Okay.
So when they're studying a work example, you can prompt them to explain each step, to make connections to their prior knowledge.
And that helps them understand it better.
Yeah, it forces them to actively process the information. It's not just passively reading or watching.
Okay, so it's about engaging with the material.
Exactly. But you have to be careful not to overload them, of course.
Right, always keep that cognitive load in mind.
Absolutely. And then there's the imagination effect.
Okay, that sounds interesting.
This one's about the power of mental rehearsal.
Okay.
So imagining a concept or process can actually be more effective than just studying it.
Really?
Yeah, but it depends on prior knowledge. If someone's a novice, they might not be able to imagine effectively.
Right.
But as they gain knowledge, Imagination becomes a more powerful tool.
Okay, so it's like you need a foundation to build on.
Exactly. And then we have the isolated elements effect.
Okay.
This one applies when the information is so complex, so highly interconnected, that it just overwhelms working memory.
Okay, so what do you do in those cases?
You break it down.
Okay.
You focus on understanding each element in isolation first. And then, once those are mastered, you can start putting the pieces together.
So it's kind of like simplifying a complex problem.
Exactly.
Mm.
And this relates to the idea of simple to complex sequencing. Start with the basics, then gradually build up to the harder stuff.
Okay, that makes sense. And then we have the collective working memory effect, which sounds like it has to do with group work.
It does. It's the idea that a group can have a larger working memory capacity than any individual.
Okay.
So the cognitive load can be shared.
Makes sense, but wouldn't there be some drawbacks to that?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
You have to factor in the cost of communication and coordination, what are sometimes called transaction costs.
Right.
And research suggests that collaboration is more effective for high-load tasks, where the benefits outweigh the costs. But for low-load tasks, working individually might be better.
So it depends on the complexity of the task.
Exactly. And then finally, we have the human movement effect.
Okay.
This one explains why animations can be so effective for teaching tasks that involve movement.
Oh, interesting.
It seems like we have a natural ability to learn by watching and imitating actions.
Right.
And animations can tap into that,
Okay.
especially when they're realistic and show the specific movements involved. There's even a possible link to the mirror neuron system, which fires both when we do something and when we watch someone else do it.
Wow. So our brains are wired for learning from movement.
It seems so. And all these new effects, they've really expanded our understanding of how cognitive load works in different situations.
Yeah, it's fascinating how much we've learned in just a couple of decades. And the article also talks about advancements in measuring cognitive load, which is obviously important for testing these ideas.
Absolutely. You can't really study something if you can't measure it.
Right. So what are some of the new ways we're measuring cognitive load?
Well, there's the subjective rating scale, which is still widely used. It's basically a simple questionnaire where learners rate how much mental effort they put in.
Okay.
And while it doesn't distinguish between different types of load, it's still a pretty good measure overall.
Right.
There are also some newer questionnaires that are specifically designed to measure different types of load.
Oh, okay.
And then there are objective measures, like using a secondary task while someone's learning,
Okay.
or using physiological measures like EEG or eye tracking.
Oh, wow. That's getting pretty high tech.
It is. And these objective measures have a lot of potential, but they also have some limitations. So it's still an area of active research.
Right. So there's still a lot to learn about measuring cognitive load.
Absolutely. It's a complex phenomenon.
Okay, so we've talked about the foundations of cognitive load theory, how it's evolved, and how we measure it. What about the future? What are some of the exciting new directions for research in this area?
Well, there are several really interesting avenues that researchers are exploring. One is